can focus and I don't have all the options. So go ahead and start recording it. Everybody else will know that it's going to be doing that. It should send us, yep, good, perfect. And that way we can put this, if there's some good information, we'll be able to put this recording on over to you. So people who can't make it today or tomorrow will be able to view it. So I just want to let people know that they will be recorded. If you're uncomfortable with that, again, you can submit your questions via the Over to You website. So with that, it looks like we're ready to go. I don't think we have anybody left in the waiting rooms. Melissa, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, Kelly. So I will start off with a brief presentation, and then, as Kelly said, we have staff members here who are ready to answer any questions that you might have. So I'll just start sharing the presentation. Okay. So again, welcome to the open house. This is one of 2 open houses today from 1 to 2. The second open house will be held tomorrow evening from 6 to 7 p.m. Following the open houses, a public hearing where Planning Committee will be considering the proposed amendments will be held on June 28th at 1 p.m. So we'll start off with a little bit of background. Under the Planning Act, the city is required to undertake regular reviews of the official plan, which is a policy document to guide growth and development of the city and to ensure that policies are consistent with current provincial legislation, plans, and policies. Sudbury's current review process has been divided into 2 phases. The first phase was adopted by Council on June 26, 2018, and approved with modifications by the province on April 26, 2018. These changes dealt with a number of policies, including growth and settlement, lake water quality, climate change, planning for an aging population, and local food. Some of these amendments to the official plan require implementation through the zoning bylaw. Those related to shoreline development, shopping center commercial zone, the limited general commercial zone, and farm consolidation are ones that in particular that required amendment to the zoning bylaw. So I'll provide a brief overview of each change and then we'll open it up to questions. So the first that we'll be discussing is farm consolidation. In agricultural areas, there are limitations on when lots can be created in order to preserve farmland. In instances where 2 agricultural lots are merged together to form through a farm consolidation and each contain an existing dwelling, one surplus farm dwelling is permitted to be severed, provided that the new lot will be limited to the size that's required to accommodate dwelling, well, and septic system, and must meet minimum distance separation requirements from adjacent livestock operations. So those policies are already in place in the official plan, and what the proposed amendments to the zoning bylaw do are to establish minimum lot area and implement maximum lot area as well as a minimum frontage. And what that will do in those instances where we're creating a lot with an existing residential dwelling through farm consolidation, it would eliminate the need for rezoning in those instances. So the next slide, this is just a sketch that illustrates the type of scenario where this would occur. So you would have 2 farm parcels that are directly abutting each other, each containing an existing dwelling. And this amendment would pertain specifically to the dashed outline square where there's an existing dwelling, and provided that it met the minimum lot area of 0.4 hectares, maximum lot area of 1 hectare, and the minimum frontage of 45 meters, the zoning bylaw amendment would not be required. The next change pertains to the limited general commercial zone. This zone is essentially the shoulder area between the downtown and surrounding areas. Amendments to the official plan require both a minimum and a maximum height limit for the shoulder area to the central business district. At present in the zoning bylaw, we provide for a maximum height of 34 meters in the C4 zone. The proposed amendment to the zoning bylaw would introduce a minimum height of 8 meters to the C4 zone which is consistent with the minimum height that's currently permitted in the downtown or C6 commercial zone. So this proposed amendment will provide for an appropriate height transition between the downtown and adjacent areas. The next changes pertain to the shopping center commercial zone. This proposed amendment does not directly relate to phase 1 of the review of the official plan, but rather to the recent LaSalle corridor official plan amendment. This change also builds on recent changes to the zoning bylaw that introduced permission for long-term care facilities, retirement homes, and multiple dwellings as permitted uses within the C5 zone. The proposed amendments would remove the current maximum lot coverage requirement of 50% and remove the maximum gross floor area limitation, which limits gross floor area to 100% of the lot area. The intent of these amendments is to provide more flexibility for development of C5 properties. The current provisions that we have in place for parking and loading, as well as the minimum requirements of 15% landscape open space, will provide sufficient limitation to lot coverage on these lots. Those provisions, as well as site plan control, will be used to achieve high quality design on these sites. And the final set of changes pertain to shoreline development. A key focus of phase 1 of the 5-year review of the official plan was protection of lakes. And while the official plan already contains policies to protect sensitive groundwater features, these policies were further strengthened through the review process. The first change or proposed amendment to the bylaw would establish a setback for development from a lake or a river of 30 meters, which is an increase from the current 12-meter requirement. Shoreline structures such as saunas, docks, pump houses, decks will still be permitted within the setback area. The setback for development from adjacent to permanently flowing streams will remain at the current 12-meter setback. The second proposed change pertains to leaching beds. So the setback for leaching beds will be increased to 30 meters adjacent to lakes, rivers, and streams. The third change pertains to the shoreline buffer area. So the shoreline buffer area will increase from the current 12-meter setback to 20 meters abutting lakes and rivers, and adjacent to streams it will remain at the current 12 meters. These policies, the policies that are related to shoreline buffer area that may be cleared of natural vegetation haven't changed. The associated provisions that allow for a clearing of a maximum of 25% of the buffer area, not to exceed an area of 276 meters square or a length of 23 meters, remain in place. So the city does recognize that there are a number of existing lots in the city that may not be able to develop or redevelop in accordance with these new requirements. What this slide demonstrates is that the 30-meter setback, what the 30-meter setback adjacent to our water bodies looks like. So the red that you see there represents a 30-meter setback from a lake within our city. The yellow is demonstrating what we estimated to be a building envelope that would incorporate the required setback from the road of 7.5 meters, as well as a building envelope of about 12.5 square meters. And the green represents an area where people would have sufficient area to develop beyond those boundaries. So what this example shows is that in any given area, there can be a range of properties in terms of properties that have existing development within the 30-meter setback. They range, lots across the city range in terms of their shape, their sizes, their configuration. So we have done a bit of analysis, and we recognize that there will be instances where variances will be required in order to facilitate development. Again, we do have provisions in the zoning bylaw that deal with non-complying situations that will allow people to develop, whether it's a vacant lot or whether they're looking to reconstruct or make additions to existing structures on the property. This next slide shows a few scenarios that we've considered. So the first scenario shows an existing structure that is fully within the 30-meter setback. In this instance, if an addition were proposed, a variance would be required versus situations where, for example, in scenario B, there's an existing structure that is partially within the 30-meter setback and partially outside of the setback, and the proposed addition is fully outside of the setback. In those instances, unless another variance were identified, there wouldn't be a required variance directly related to this 30-meter setback. So staff understand that there will be a period of transition, and we will be working with property owners, building services, and our colleagues at NDCA and the health unit as well, as these provisions are implemented in the zoning bylaw. So again, just to go back to timelines, we are holding the 2 open houses today and tomorrow, followed by a public hearing on June 28th, and that is the date where Planning Committee will be considering the draft zoning bylaw. So if we haven't answered your questions through this meeting, there is still the opportunity to participate at the public hearing as well. And with that, Kelly, I'll open it up to the question and answer period.
Okay, great. So just to refresh, there are 2 ways to ask a question here. Please raise your hand with a little icon at the top of your screen. If you hover over it, there's a little raise hand icon. Or if you click on the button next to that, there's a little chat bubble. It says show conversation. You'll be able to put your question into there and I can read it for you. So first up, we have Phil Reynolds, who has a question. Go ahead, Phil. You'll have to unmute. Perfect.
Yeah, and hi everybody. Thanks a lot for that presentation. It was very helpful on getting a good understanding of exactly what's going on. Just a quick question. This might be too detailed for this call, but my wife and I bought a property on Wanapate with an understanding of the setback requirements at the time we bought it, essentially. And it's a slope property, so we put quite a bit of money into the property, trying to figure out how we would build a property that was effectively usable. Even though there's lots of space behind us, the property is on a very steep slope and it graduates up quite significantly. We bought the property not with a view to putting a house, 30 meters back from the property. We bought the property and spent quite a bit of money figuring out the engineering to put a house that was more closer to the existing setback. We have a permit application that's about to go in. We're going to pay the fee on all that good stuff. What are the chances of that sort of getting through before the deadline, and how would most people address that? Because this, redoing a permit application would involve a whole new set of drawings, a whole new configuration of the property, and it's actually not why we bought the property with that in mind. So I know this is an open house, but can you give me any guidance on what the city's thinking might be in that particularized situation? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for your question, Phil. And we do understand that there are people that are in the midst of the development process. What I would advise is that you said you're imminently planning on submitting a permit application, and I would suggest perhaps proceeding as quickly as possible with that particular process. There is a little bit of time still before these policy changes come into effect. So in terms of next steps, their planning committee will be considering the amendments at the meeting on June 28th, but there's still a bit of administrative process that would still have to occur. So if planning committee, for example, were to adopt the proposed changes on June 28th, that decision would still have to go to council for ratification, and then back to council again for adoption of the bylaw, after which there's still a 20-day appeal period. So we're anticipating that these amendments would likely not come into effect until about September. So there's a little bit of time there, but in the event that you were not able to submit your permit and have it approved within that time frame, there is still the option to apply for a minor variance. So the minor variance, that process is a fairly quick process. Generally speaking, approvals occur within about a month of the date of submission, and what would be considered during that would be things such as you've mentioned, physical constraints on the property. If there's major topographic constraints that would prevent you from meeting the required setbacks. In other instances, you've mentioned that you perhaps have a lot that would be of sufficient area but have other constraints. In other instances, people might not have sufficient area to be able to meet these setbacks, or they might have an irregular shaped lot that prevents them from meeting those setbacks. So all of those things are things that that staff and the Committee of Adjustment would take into consideration when reviewing proposals. I mean, every circumstance is different. So again, it does take a bit of a case-by-case evaluation, but there are options options to deal with the situation.
Well, thank you for that. That's super helpful. And I guess the question, and I'll finish off here. I don't want to take too much airtime, but I guess the real question is, we expedite our application for a building permit. You're going to evaluate the building permit within the confines of the existing setback laws as they sit for the city of Sudbury now. Is that my understanding? Okay. Okay, that's super helpful. Appreciate the presentation. I won't take any more of your time. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Philip, for your question. Okay, so we have another question and a hand up from Dawson Proudfoot. Go ahead, Dawson. You can unmute your mic.
It's actually his wife, Julie, on his account. So I'm just trying to understand the logic behind the last slide. Looked like if they already are in it's not contravention yet, but would be in contravention of the new bylaw. So already within the 30-meter setback, but want to do an addition, there is no variance required. So it's almost like, well, you are already breaking the law, breaking the new bylaw, so we'll let you continue. Whereas if they weren't in contravention of the new bylaw, they do need a variance. What's the logic behind that? I don't know who to address the question to.
Sure, I'll pull up that slide so that we can have a look at that while we're answering the question. And I will say that this is just one of many scenarios. So this is just one that we felt would illustrate some of the situations that we're going to come across. So in scenario A, the existing dwelling wouldn't comply with the current 30-meter setback.
Sorry, Melissa, I just want to mention, so for those that are watching, the water is actually at the top. That isn't indicated.
Yes,
So
that might help.
Yeah.
Okay, so I misinterpreted that. I thought scenario A had them totally within the 30-meter setback to begin with, so it didn't make sense. Okay, but still, there is a bit of a logic question on this one still.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in the instant, yeah, thank you for clarifying that, Stephen. So the water would be at the top of the screen. So in scenario A, the existing dwelling is within the 30-meter setback, and a portion of the addition would also be within the required setback. So the variance would be required for that portion of the addition that does not comply with the required 30-meter setback, versus scenario B, where a portion of the dwelling is located within the required 30-meter setback, but the entirety of the addition meets the 30-meter setback requirement.
Okay, that clarification it's totally makes sense now. Thank you very much.
I'm glad you asked, because I didn't realize that either. So very, very good thing to point out there. So I'm sure other people had some questions as well. Anybody else have any questions? I don't see any hands raised. Oh, there we go. St. Charles Lake, if that's your first or last name, I'm not sure. Sorry, go ahead.
It's a group. I just wonder if and when people start applying for variances, will the application or the review be different in circumstances where the lots will be on city services, whereas they're on private services?
Yes, thank you for the question. So the setback is applied to all waterfront lots. And so in that scenario, there wouldn't be the need to meet the 30-meter setback for a septic system if you were on city services. But again, any request for variance, the same types of considerations would be made in terms of the size of the existing lot, the existing footprint of any structures, and any topographical or other constraints on that site. And Stephen, it's looking like you want to add to that response as well.
No, I think you answered it sufficiently.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, St. Charles Lake. Anybody else have any questions? Okay, go ahead, Phil. You have another question?
Oh yeah, sorry. I just thought I would take this opportunity to ask one more. There's probably a huge backlog sitting with you folks to review building applications because of COVID or whatever. And I just, is that true? And if so, do you see any abnormal delays in processing a application that's received imminently?
So, good question. Unfortunately, we don't have anybody here to represent the building services department. We have heard that there is a significant volume of applications that the city is seeing, but unfortunately, I wouldn't really be able to speak to the timeline or delays that may be experienced in that regard.
Yeah, well, the best bet, Phil, on a case-by-case basis is to call 311, ask to speak with building services, and ask them that very question.
Yeah, okay, no problem. Thanks for that.
Next we have Naomi. Go ahead, Naomi, and unmute your mic, please.
Yeah, sorry, my computer is very slow. First, I just want to support these new shoreline buffers. I'm really pleased to see the buffers more consistent with the MOE requirements for water quality, and that's a great change for our city. I'm curious with the analysis you did in terms of where variances would be required. Do you have an idea of like percentage shoreline on given lakes, and like how much of the shoreline lots left to be developed would be able to be compliant with the new buffer versus not? And are there a large number on some of the smaller lakes that wouldn't be able to fit in with the new buffer?
Yes, thank you for that, Naomi. We've done a sample analysis of Long Lake, and what we found is that of the approximately 571 lots on the lake, there are 64 that are currently vacant. And it actually looks as though 42 out of the 64 would, and this is without doing a site-specific analysis to look at topography of those things, but from a desktop exercise, it appears that about 42 out of the 64 would have sufficient area to potentially comply with the new setbacks. So we haven't extended that analysis to other lakes in the city, but we would expect that we may have similar results on other lakes. So there's a few. So for example, on Long Lake, 8 out of the 64 looks as though their area is essentially within the 30-meter setback, and there's really not much room beyond that 30-meter setback. So on those particular properties, I would expect that those property owners would be seeking a variance in order to develop the site, but a large percentage look like they may be able to comply.
Mm-hmm. And during a variance application, would the lake management classification come into play in terms of the existing phosphorus sensitivity and levels in the lake?
Yes, absolutely. So we do have new official plan policies that came into effect when phase 1 of the OP review was adopted in 2019. So perhaps maybe Stephen would like to speak to some of those changes.
Sorry, so yeah, just so that I understand the question. So this is specifically asking when there's a minor variance application, will the lake management classification come into play?
That's correct. Thanks.
Okay. Yes, so that definitely in terms of recommendation to the Committee of Adjustment. In some instances, there are some lakes that can handle more phosphorus than others, but again, phosphorus is only one of the items that is being addressed by the longer setback. And there's other aspects like habitat, erosion control, etc., that really don't come to play in terms of the lake management classification, but still have bearing on maintaining that setback.
Right, and you would be commenting on the application in that regard.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thanks, Naomi, for your questions. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, if nobody else has questions. Oh, we got one. Richard, go ahead.
Thanks. My question is about the shoreline setback. My understanding is that the shoreline buffer is now going to be 20 meters from the high water mark. Can you tell me what it was in the previous bylaw?
Sure. So under the current zoning bylaw, the shoreline buffer area was a 12-meter setback, and it is proposed to increase to 20 meters.
And thanks, Melissa. And how much of that could be removed?
So it is a 25% of the shoreline to a maximum of 276 meters square, or a maximum of 23 meters, which would be linear along the shoreline. So whichever is the greater.
Okay. And how long has that particular bylaw been enforced?
The shoreline buffer provisions have been in place since, I believe, 2010. Is that your recollection, Stephen?
So
well, in terms of it was that way in the official plan. So that would have come together probably 2005, 2006, and then ratified as a zoning bylaw a little bit later. So and it just the correction, it's whichever is lesser. So we're looking at the lesser. So it's either 23 meters or it's going to be 25% of the shoreline buffer area.
Okay, so as I look at new construction in many locations within the Sudbury area, I can see that there is no shoreline buffer left whatsoever. So my first question is, how is that piece of the bylaw enforced? And my second question would be, what's the penalty if someone goes ahead and removes far more of that buffer than they're legally allowed to do?
Do you want to address that one, Melissa, in terms of enforcement, or because like, as you know, Richard, we typically will look at trying to work with our lake stewardship groups and trying to get the message out and trying to use a carrot approach rather than the stick. But we do have, obviously a limited staff complement that can go out and certainly police these kinds of things.
But if someone goes ahead and removes more than they're legally allowed to do in terms of that bylaw, what would be the penalty for that individual? Would there be a penalty?
So these enforcement is typically done through a complaint basis. And then from there, if there's kind of prosecution, I think the Planning Act sets out maximum fines if it's a zoning infraction. And then the Building Code Act also sets out some maximum fines. I think I could look up the numbers while we go to another question, or if you have other questions. But I think it might be, I don't know off the top of my head, Melissa, like 25,000 or 50,000 in some cases. And then there's a per day, if you're not in compliance. But I could look that up.
Yeah, but as Stephen mentioned, the approach typically in the city has been to try and work through our lake stewardship groups and through education and outreach to encourage people to revegetate their shorelines in instances where the vegetation has been removed. But then, as Ed mentioned, there are provisions in the Planning Act that do allow for enforcement. But again, it is on a complaints basis. We don't have the staff capacity to go out there and monitor every shoreline of every lake within the city.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Next, we have a question from Aaron. Go ahead, Aaron, and unmute your mic.
Hi, how are you? I just had I have a bit of a unique situation. We have property on Clearwater Lake, and it was a family cottage originally. So the cottage is still existing, and topographically, I don't think I'd have the setback. We have a rock outcrop that basically divides the property in two. And on one side of the road side of the outcrop, we have a field bed that has not been hooked up yet, which will probably have to be upgraded to meet standards today. Anyways, as well as there's a garage on that side. So the existing camp is probably closer to example B that you showed with, it's either within the setback or maybe a little bit over the setback from the lake, from the original. So our original plan was to build this year, but with COVID pricing, everything's a little bit ridiculous. So we were going to hopefully wait till next year before we applied for permits as well. But as far as the camp may or may not be usable structurally, so I was just wondering, as far as if the camp were to come down, am I able to use the existing footprint of, and then add on to the back within, it would be towards the backside, towards the roadside, we would like to develop, basically is.
Okay, so I can provide some general response, but it does sound like this is a situation where you might want to be consulting with our building services when you get to the time where you
I was going to say it's kind of very in-depth.
Yeah.
Go and check it out.
But we do have provisions in the zoning bylaw that speak to non-complying lots, buildings, and structures. Okay. And those provisions do speak to enlargement, reconstruction, repair, or renovation. And in instances where you're not increasing the footprint, these provisions would allow you to do so. So there's certain instances. So for example, if you were reconstructing and you weren't increasing the gross floor area, at least not within the required setback, depending on your specific circumstance, you may not require a variance based on those reconstruction policies. But if you did, for example, exceed the gross floor area, or a portion of your proposed addition was within the setback, there is the option to proceed through the variance process.
Okay. Yeah, just because the existing cottage is only 20 by 24, it's about 480 square feet, so it would definitely have to be enlarged. The proposed addition would be on not the new setback, but on the 12-meter setback. It would be behind that. Was our planning, but like I said, then there's only so far I can go back with the rock outcrop there, so without getting into major blasting or disrupting the property. So.
Right, absolutely, and that is something that would be taken into consideration by staff when they were reviewing your application.
Okay, and you were saying these new the new zoning bylaw would take effect probably within September-ish.
That's what we're anticipating based on the process and timelines, is that in all likelihood it will be September before the bylaw is in effect.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Okay, now we have a question from Denise. Go ahead, Denise, and unmute your mic.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I kind of heard two things here, and if you can please instruct me on what is it, a 20 meter setback or a 30 meter setback?
Right. So I can provide a little bit of clarity there. So the 30-meter setback is a requirement for new buildings and structures other than shoreline structures. So your things like your cottage, a garage, and accessory structures that are not related to shoreline use must meet the 30-meter setback. You can still have shoreline structures, so saunas, docks, gazebos, those types of structures can still occur closer to the water. The 20-meter requirement is for the shoreline buffer area. So that's the area that must be maintained in its natural state of vegetation, other than the provisions that allow you to clear up to 25% of the shoreline area. So the 30-meter is for primary buildings and structures, and the 20 meters is for your shoreline vegetated buffer area.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Now, my next question is, how is that going to improve or concern with the lakes by moving it back 20 or 30 meters? What study has been done? I'm just trying to understand what difference that's going to make.
Okay, so there have been a number. So first principles, I guess, is that the wider the buffer, the better. So that's the rule of thumb. So if you have 10 meters, it's better than 5 meters. If you have 15, it's better than 10, et cetera, and onward you go. You could move up to 200-300 meters. Obviously, there has to come in play a certain degree of reasonableness in terms of the amount of gains that you're getting in return, ecological gains, benefit to the lake, etc. And understanding, of course, that folks want to build somewhere near a lake. Over the years, both in the United States, Canada, a number of studies have shown that the sweet spot seems to lie at about 30 meters. So 30 meters seems to be, as a setback, the gains are great enough to make a significant difference, but it's not so far back that it would be considered unreasonable by those wanting to have a shoreline residence. So that applies, again, in a number of different jurisdictions in the United States, in Canada, and certainly has been upheld here in Ontario by the Ministry of the Environment, now the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks over the years. So that's typically the recommended value. We had initially put in 20 meters so that the 20 meter setback would be consistent with this 20 meter shoreline buffer. The province modified that in our official plan to 30 meters to make it consistent again with their approach, which again, as I laid out, is not an unreasonable one. This makes a bit of a disparity in terms of the 20 meter natural buffer of natural vegetation. The only requirement is 20 meters. We certainly would encourage those that are planning to develop to keep a natural buffer up to 30 meters with the allowable amount of cleared area. So again, you're looking at benefits as wildlife habitat, erosion control, the sediment control that goes with the erosion, and general overall benefit to the lake in terms of the amount of filtering that's happening with whatever activities are taking place on the property per se. So
Yeah.
does that?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying there. However, I realize that by looking and doing some studies that the two areas of concern for our Sudbury lakes are road salt and lawn fertilizer. So even by moving our properties further away, it's not going to reduce road salt or lawn fertilizer. And I was wondering if anything is being looked at reducing that, because it is killing our Sudbury lakes, as you are well aware.
Okay, so there's no specific study being undertaken in Sudbury per se. Salt is something that we do now measure in certain lakes, not all of our lakes. We are looking at sodium and chloride, but and we do the annual phosphorus monitoring as well on a number of different lakes, and we've done that for decades, really. Right, previous to us was the Ministry of the Environment doing that work. In terms of lawn fertilizers, around the middle of the 2000s, there was a major shift that happened in the manufacturing of lawn fertilizers, where the phosphate that was put in, so the number in the middle of the three numbers, first being nitrogen, the second one being phosphorus, and the last one being potassium, of the middle number, much of that was removed in the general use lawn fertilizers. So if you're going to go to a big box store, Canadian Tire, et cetera, you're more apt to find a general use lawn fertilizer that has no phosphorus in the middle. And phosphorus is really the limiting factor in terms of nutrients that would contribute to algal blooms in our lakes. So that has been sort of removed, if you will. It doesn't take care of the nitrogen. So that's another reason why to keep the wider buffer, the better. Nitrogen is not necessarily directly linked. So it's not, I shouldn't say that. It's not a limiting factor for algal blooms, but certainly can be contributing to that. And we certainly, that's one of the reasons why moving with a wider buffer is helping to absorb and filter out some of the nitrogen before it hits the water, as well as potassium and whatever else. But anyhow, does that answer the question specifically for that?
Somewhat. I just don't see what the difference, by moving the properties back, how that's going to make a significant difference. I'm just trying to wrap my mind around it, and I'm trying to, reason with, and I don't understand. But like, what is a concern also is to see a lot of these streams and rivers that are flowing from our streets pouring directly into the lake, and I could see at the mouth of these rivers and creeks and whatnot, and the pollutants and the things that are accumulated. And I was kind of hoping that there would be something to tackle that, which is, primary, it's a huge source of what's going on and the pollutants that are going into our lake. Wondering if there's any thought of a form of filtration or something to clear that before it pours into the lake. That would definitely be helpful.
Well, I mean, that's probably a conversation for another place, but I would say we also have, in terms of setbacks, we also have a 12, in our official plan, we have 12-meter setback from streams. That's to serve purpose as well as providing a natural buffer. And certainly over the years, we've taken a more watershed-based approach to land use planning in Greater Sudbury. So looking at the inflows, looking at stormwater control, looking at on-site stormwater control for both water quantity and water quality. So there's a number of different measures that have been taken in place, but they're all there to help to modify or help to reduce, I guess, the amounts of undesirable substances reaching the lake per se, the receiving waters.
So I'll just jump in a little bit here, Denise, and say, these are all very important pieces to a puzzle. And I believe what we are addressing here is, one of those pieces, and those are sort of different areas that need focus and attention and whatnot. But we would move ahead with those types of things in a different area. So we need to sort of discuss this particular issue. And while it does relate, it's sort of a different discussion altogether as well. And I know that the city has been working very hard on their salt programs and that sort of thing. So there's definitely information we can share. And actually, if you maybe send us an email or re-ask the question on over to you, we'll be able to address it with more than just, you know, the planners who are focusing on this particular piece of the bylaw. So that might help get some answers and maybe get us to dig in a little deeper there.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I appreciate it because we have beautiful lakes and we do need to save them. And I realize now that these are different organizations and whatnot that different groups that we need to talk to. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Denise. We appreciate you coming. So our next question is from I'm going to say a username. You're going to know who you are when I say NWITTKE. And so go ahead and unmute your mic if that sounds familiar to you.
Hi, yes, it's Nicole Whitkey. I'm from the St. Charles Lake Association as well. So it basically, and I appreciate the fact that we are increasing that buffer zone in the bylaws. So that's a great move. And I also appreciate that we want to use the carrot versus the rod, as Stephen mentioned. And as an association, we have tried to do that in terms of providing our residents with information about the buffer zone and or what plants to plant, you know, in that zone. But when there's a blatant disregard for the bylaw and you know, and people are just basically ripping down the buffer zone. In particular, we have a neighbor that actually extended a shoreline out into the lake by adding aggregates and then doing a lot of hard surfacing. And you know, and we're provided, it was brought to their attention. I mean, we as neighbors did approach them, and because I'm also on the association, felt a responsibility to approach them in, you know, in a kind, friendly, neighborly way. But how, when it's still a blatant disregard, like they really don't care, what else can an association do? I mean, we're not policemen to the lake.
Sure.
What's the recourse?
Sure. My recommendation would be, if you've had these conversations with them, the next step would be to call 311 at the city, and 311 staff will record your issues or your complaint, and then they will advise the appropriate staff members as to what the situation is. And I think in this instance, then there would potentially be a collaboration between staff from building services, planning services, as to how we would react to this situation. I mean, as was spoken to earlier, there are provisions in the Planning Act that would allow us to fine, but there, you know, perhaps a conversation with different city staff with the property owner might rectify the situation. But I would suggest contacting 311 would be your best approach.
And is that a confidential call?
I believe you can request that they not record your name. I'm not sure, Kelly, maybe you have some insight into that.
Yes, I do. I can jump in here. So yes, it is a confidential call. In fact, the process is logged into a system in the back end that only people who are allowed to see bylaw complaints can actually view it. So it's there's a lot of process that takes place to make sure that even most city staff won't know that you've called and complained, much less your neighbor. We also launched something a few weeks ago, 311.greatersudbury.ca. So right online, if you go to that address, you can actually submit your complaint online to bylaw regarding zoning, zoning non-permitted use of land, and you can actually send in your request there, which is again confidential. and the city will actually send you updates via email or via text if you want, whatever you choose, so that you will know when we've gone through the process of determining the complaint and its validity and talking to the neighbors and whatnot. So 311.greatersudbury.ca, you can do it that way, and you don't even have to talk to anybody at 311 if that makes you more comfortable.
Okay, thank you very much.
So
You're very
Nicole,
welcome.
maybe just to continue that on that conversation is that as several of you know that are on this call, that shoreline issues have always been a bit problematic because it really is a distributed portfolio. So the city has some aspect of it. Conservation Sudbury has other aspects, Ministry of the Environment, Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So if somebody is putting aggregate, for example, they're in infraction of provincial regulation, and possibly in terms of introducing deleterious substances into the lake, they're infraction of a federal regulation, the Fisheries Act. So there's a number of different bodies, I guess, that have responsibilities relating specifically to the shoreline. Ours is a fairly limited one, but others have much larger, in your words, have much larger rods to strike with than we do.
Okay,
So
thank you.
it's one of those unfortunate things that, yeah, it is a distributed portfolio, and you have to know, depending on the infraction that's being committed, who to turn to, what organ, what ministry or agency to turn to.
Right, thank you very much.
Thanks, Denise. Our next speaker or question comes from Phil Reynolds. Hello, Phil. Do you have another question for us?
Thanks, third dumb question of the session. And Stephen, thank you for that chemistry lesson on fertilizers. I understood very little about it, but I found it fun to listen to in any event. This is probably a question for Melissa. These shoreline amendments, do they apply notwithstanding the type of zoning you're in? So say you're an SLS 5, you're a rec property, you own property in one of those zones. Does any of this change because of that, or is this applicable to any property on a shoreline in the province of Ontario?
Great, thanks for that question, Phil. So these amendments are general provisions, meaning that they apply to all shoreline lots, regardless of whether you're zoned SLS or RS. So yes, they're blanket throughout. So that setback would apply to all properties within the city of Greater Sudbury.
Okay, thank you. Great.
Thanks, Phil. We have a few minutes left, so if we have any last minute questions, go ahead and raise your hand or give us a little chat, and we'll go ahead and ask them. Hello, Councillor Kerwin. Welcome to our lovely meeting.
Hi.
Yes, Richard, you have a question? Go ahead and unmute your mic, please.
No, actually, I don't have a question. I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to engage and to learn more about this. I think it's a great approach for citizens to be able to access and get more information about what the city's doing by having this kind of a network set up, and it's easy for people to access it by computer. I'd encourage you to continue this approach. Thank you very much.
You know what, Richard, we really appreciate that, because, we are always looking for ways to reach out to the community that is easy for them, not easy for us, easy for them, easy for you guys to be able to talk to us and ask us questions. And I think this has been a really great way to do that. So we appreciate your feedback on that one.
Yeah, ditto for Phil. Thank you.
Thanks.
Especially the chemistry part.
All right, if I don't see any other further questions. So again, just to wrap up a little bit, I'll leave it to Melissa to give us a little wrap up. So we have any sort of information that you'll need for this on Over To You. You'll just go to overtoyou.greatersudbury.ca. You'll have we'll put this presentation up so you can view it again if you'd like to. And you can ask us questions there, and we'll get back to you right there on the Over to You website. So if you can't think of anything, or if you think of another question after the fact, you can always get a hold of us there. Again, if you have any questions that you want to submit to 311 or bylaw, whatnot, 311.greatersudbury.ca is our new portal. You can actually ask us directly there, including zoning bylaw information right on that portal. And we have another session of this tomorrow, so you can always join us again tomorrow. Melissa, I think you know what time that is. I think it's a little later in the day so that we could, become convenient for all schedules. And then, so I wanted to thank everybody. So thank you for coming. And if you have any feedback on these types of virtual sessions, please let us know if you have any tips or things you think we could be doing differently or better or whatnot. So thank you, Melissa. I'll leave it to you to wrap things up.
Okay, well, thank you, Kelly. I think you covered most of it, so thank you for that. So as Kelly mentioned, though, this is one of 2 open houses, so we will be holding another session, identical format as what we did today, tomorrow evening from 6 to 7. So again, we'd start off with a presentation followed by Q&A. So if there are questions that you think of before tomorrow's session, feel free to join that session. Alternatively, there is the Over to You site that we have set up with our contact information, and more information about this proposed amendment is also available on that site. So previous report that went to Planning Committee in May that described the proposed changes is posted there, as well as the public notice. So again, these 2 open house sessions are leading up to the public hearing. So Planning Committee will be considering the amendments on June 28th. A copy of the notice is provided on the Over to You page as well. So if you do want to participate in that public hearing session, you can register with clerks, or if you would like to submit written comments, you can email clerk services as well. And I think that's about it in terms of wrapping things up. Again, our email addresses are on the Over to You page. So if you're more comfortable contacting one of us one-on-one versus in a public format like this, please feel free to do so. And thank you for joining us today.